If you're like me, you grew up thinking that mental illness is one of those things that if if your brain is broken, if it's not working right, and you're having problems, then you're stuck like that. Um, and that it's a mental illness. And what I want to talk about is this conference, Trauma 24, and just how transformative all of that, and solidly rooted in neuroscience, all of the development in this all of the presentations that happened during this conference, this 2-day conference. And even more so, I want to talk a little bit about how empowering this change in the story about mental illness is for us. So I'm going to play a little clip of 𝘂𝑚 Fisher sort of setting the tone for the conference. And in this clip, she talks about, well, let me play the clip first.
All right, so mental illness is neither mental nor illness. Okay, this is very important. It's going to be hard to change all this vocabulary, but it's the mental illness that we're talking about, developmental trauma, affects the brain's capacity to organize and regulate itself. It doesn't become mental until the brain is malfunctioning, right? So it's a brain problem, fundamentally a brain problem. This is a message to take to the world. It also is not illness, right? It's an adaptation. It's a fundamental, the brain is aligning with the conditions to serve its own survival.
So she talks about how mental illness is neither. It's not mental and it's not illness. And I want to talk just a little bit about what that means for me. So the idea that it's not mental is really going back to this idea that we've had for hundreds of years, since René Descartes, right? This Cartesian idea that there's a distinction to be made in the way that we live between what is mental and what is physical. And there's lots of research around this. There's research showing, for example, that if people do a brain scan of what their behavioral dysfunctionality, and it shows some evidence in the brain scan, that's considered physical, and people who are interviewed later about that person will think that the problem is much more substantial and much more difficult to address than if they don't show any proof on a physical side, like results in a brain scan. So there's evidence that shows that a lot of the things that people face, the behavioral disturbances that we face, are actually rooted in the way the brain works. And that goes to the second part of what 𝘂𝑚 Fisher is talking about, which is that it's not an illness. Like, we've had this idea for a really long time that, especially with behavioral, and part of this comes from psychologists wanting to be taken seriously like doctors, like physical doctors, throughout history, this idea that it's actually it's mental, but it's a real problem. It's a real illness. And what the neuroscience is showing now is that, in fact, the human system is just directed towards always finding a way to be in a safe condition. So that's really what it is. All of the behavioral dysfunction is rooted in this idea that the body and the person is just trying to keep themselves safe. And this may not be happening on a cortical level. It may not be happening consciously. The person may not actually even be aware of what they're doing. There's a famous example, for example, with Winona Ryder from ages ago, where she was shoplifting, even though she had lots of money. And part of that comes from the research. Part of our understanding of that today comes from the research of one of the people who is presenting this conference, Dr. Ruth Lanius, showing that the default mode network for people who have a history of severe neglect and trauma, it comes online under threat. That means that whenever they feel threatened, or whenever they're doing some risky activity, that's when they feel most alive. And this goes a long way to explaining why people engage in addictive behavior, go back to abusive partners. It even explains this sort of ADHD thing where, like, I can't finish my homework assignments unless the deadline is tomorrow. And that suddenly when there's a deadline looming, then it activates that part of our body which is able to actually motivate to do the thing that's necessary. That all has to do with this understanding that what the human system is set up to do, and probably lots of other animal systems as well, is to protect itself. And so if it learns, if it develops a habit for understanding that trauma is imminent, and under those conditions it needs to take certain steps in order to keep itself safe, then that's what it does. And so that's how you get these neurophysiological outcomes that show themselves as behavioral dysfunction. That's why you get the attention-seeking behavior. That's why you get, it's hard for me to put in clear terms just how transformative this change in understanding is here. And throughout the next couple of days, I'm hoping to talk a little bit more and maybe show y'all a bit of the conference and some of the pieces that really were the most amazing takeaways to me about what this conference shows for us, and how it really suggests that there is a transformation happening in the therapeutic response to trauma and any neurophysiological issues that we have.